In 2009, a 6-year-old boy disappeared from a remote cabin in the Smoky Mountains while on a weekend getaway with his family. Despite an exhaustive search, no trace was ever found until 16 years later, when a chimney fire leads local firefighters to tear down the brickwork. What they find sealed inside the old flue changes everything and unravels a secret darker than anyone could imagine. The late afternoon sun filtered through the thick canopy of trees as the Whitaker family's SUV crunched up the gravel driveway that led to the old mountain cabin. A gentle mist curled through the pines, catching the golden light like breath on a mirror. Elise Whitaker leaned her head against the window, watching as deer bolted into the woods at the sound of the approaching engine. Her husband, Mark, gripped the steering wheel with one hand and gestured with the other toward the clearing just ahead. "There it is," he said, forcing a tone of cheer. "Exactly like the pictures." The cabin was simple wooden beams, weathered by years of storms and sunlight, a stone chimney standing solid against the backdrop of the Smoky Mountains. It looked like something from a forgotten postcard, suspended in time. Elise stepped out of the car, stretching stiff muscles from the long drive, her eyes scanning the treetops for a signal on her phone. Nothing. Noah bounded out of the back seat, his red sneakers hitting the dirt with a crunch. At 6 years old, his energy was boundless. "Can I go look around?" he asked, already halfway to the tree line. "Stay close to the cabin," Elise called after him. "And no going into the woods alone." "I won't!" he shouted back, his voice already fading behind the trees. Mark unloaded the last of their bags and looked around with a satisfied sigh. "It's perfect. Quiet, no neighbors, no cell service, just us." He smiled at Elise, who returned a weaker version of it. Inside, the cabin was musty with the scent of aged wood and old stone, but otherwise clean. A faded quilt lay neatly on the bed, and a bookshelf held yellowed paperbacks and board games with frayed corners. Mark lit a fire while Elise unpacked groceries into the narrow kitchen. An hour passed, then 2. "Noah?" Elise called from the porch, her voice sharp with the subtle panic that creeps in before the mind allows it to bloom fully. "Dinner's almost ready." No answer. Mark stepped outside, glancing toward the woods. "Noah!" he yelled, louder this time. Still silence. They split up, calling, walking the perimeter of the cabin, their voices threading through the thickening dusk. It wasn't until Mark found one small red sneaker halfway down a deer path that the truth began to rise like cold water. He held it in his hand, his eyes searching the trees, the growing darkness. Elise's scream came next, raw, full of something ancient and final. Noah was gone. The sirens arrived first, winding their way through the narrow roads of the Smoky Mountains, their echo bouncing eerily through the trees. Flashing lights painted the forest red and blue as local sheriff's deputies stepped out of their vehicles and took in the small cabin nestled in the clearing. Elise stood on the porch, clutching Noah's other sneaker in her shaking hand. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that doesn't come from horror movies or late-night thunderstorms, but from something real, something primal. Mark met the officers at the base of the porch steps. His voice cracked as he spoke, words tumbling out in frantic pieces. "He was just playing. I told him not to go far. He always listens. Always." By nightfall, the property was surrounded by people-uniformed officers, volunteers from town, even hikers who'd abandoned their plans to join the search. They moved like shadows beneath the trees, headlamps bobbing through the darkness, flashlights sweeping the underbrush as if Noah might somehow be lying just beneath a fern, asleep. Helicopters joined the effort by morning, their searchlights piercing the thick canopy as they circled low again and again with nothing to report. Canine units followed what little scent they could find around the back of the cabin, along the creek that wound like a ribbon through the pines, and then nothing. The trail vanished as quickly as it had begun. It was as if the forest had swallowed Noah whole. On the second day, Elise stood with a deputy near the edge of the clearing as a young woman emerged from the woods, holding something small and blue in her gloved hands. Elise recognized it immediately. Noah's jacket, the one with the patches on the sleeves, the one she'd made him wear even though he said it made him look like a baby. It was caught on a branch a quarter mile from the cabin, hanging there like a flag of surrender. torn slightly at the cuff, damp with morning dew. She didn't scream. Not this time. She just stared at the fabric as if it might still contain the warmth of her son's small body. Mark collapsed onto a fallen log as more volunteers passed, some whispering prayers, others just silent. There were no signs of struggle, no prints, no drag marks, no blood, just a coat caught in a tree and a hollow space where a little boy used to be. The seasons turned without meaning after Noah vanished. First came the official end to the search, a terse announcement from the sheriff's office 3 weeks after the boy disappeared. "We are transitioning to a long-term investigation," words meant to soften the truth. The truth being that no one had found anything, not a footprint, not a dropped toy, not a whisper of where he'd gone. By winter, the cabin stood empty, its windows dark, the chimney cold. Elise and Mark had left it behind after a month of waiting, hoping, begging. But the loss didn't ride home quietly in the back seat. It climbed between them, settled in like a squatter in their hearts. At first, they tried to move forward together. Elise printed flyers even after the police stopped. She mailed them to towns miles away, hundreds of miles. She called tip lines at 3 in the morning. She studied maps with a highlighter until the roads blurred into rivers. Mark went back to work at his brother's contracting business, hammering nails into boards with more force than necessary. But every night ended the same way, in silence. Two people sitting across from each other, once full of shared stories and laughter, now bound together by a grief so large it left no room for breath. 6 months in, Elise stopped going outside. She took her coffee by the window, eyes scanning the yard as if Noah might just walk out of the woods. She folded his laundry, even though it hadn't been worn in months, placing his shirts back into drawers with care. When Mark tried to touch her shoulder, she flinched. When he said Noah's name, she left the room. "I can't stay here," she said one night, her voice flat. "Not in this house, not in this town. It's all ghosts." Mark didn't argue. He didn't pack a bag either. Instead, he returned to Tennessee, rented a small trailer just outside the park border. He said it was temporary, that he needed to be closer, in case something came up. But weeks turned into months, then years. Elise moved in with her sister in North Carolina and rarely answered his calls. When she did, her voice was different, hollowed out, reshaped. And so the Whitakers became a pair of broken halves, orbiting the space where their son should have been, each too shattered to help the other heal. The kind of fracture that doesn't split clean but splinters inwards. The forest had always held stories. Long before the Whitakers arrived at the cabin with their backpacks and bright-eyed boy, the locals had whispered about that stretch of mountain like it breathed differently. There were maps that didn't chart the older footpaths, trails that seemed to vanish if you weren't born knowing them. And somewhere at the center of it all sat the cabin, quiet, old, and watching. No one spoke of it officially. It wasn't marked as haunted in tourist guides or circled in red on warning maps. But those who'd grown up nearby, who'd fished in the creeks and camped in the shadows of the Smokies, they remembered. They remembered 1973, when 2 brothers disappeared while hiking with their scout troop, last seen near the ridge above the cabin. Their father said they'd gone off trail to find a woodpecker. Search teams found their hats and nothing else. They remembered 1986, when a young girl ran from her home during a thunderstorm and was found 3 days later, half naked and shaking by a stream. She couldn't speak for months, and when she did, she only said, "He tried to make me stay in the chimney." They remembered the fire of '92, when the cabin burned down to its frame. No official cause was ever released. The flames had risen fast, unnaturally so, said those who saw it. The cabin had been rebuilt 5 years later, restored to its original blueprint by a private owner no one in town really knew. A woman, they thought. Quiet. Not local. None of this made it into the police file on Noah Whitaker. When Elise asked about past incidents, she was told there were no relevant cases in the area. Mark asked too, more forcefully. Same answer. As if a child vanishing into thin air wasn't enough to trigger old memories. But in grocery stores and bait shops, whispers stirred. Some blamed the forest itself, said it took what it wanted and gave back nothing. Others muttered about mountain men, long-dead cults, or spirits restless from wars nobody remembered properly. One woman swore she'd heard a voice in the trees when she walked past that cabin years ago. A voice that mimicked her late brother's laugh. The new stories folded into the old, passed between trembling hands over cups of coffee and low fires. No one said it aloud, not really. But when the Whitaker boy vanished, more than a few people in town stopped letting their children play near the tree line. The mountain had taken before. Now, it had taken again. The world moved on, as it always does. Years peeled away like bark from an old tree, each one quieter than the last. 16 of them passed before most people stopped whispering Noah's name. The posters faded. The flyers turned brittle and blew away on the wind. But for Elise and Mark Whitaker, time only hardened the ache into something deeper, something bone-set and quiet. Elise moved to Asheville. She found work at a library, shelving other people's stories while trying to forget her own. Her sister Diane took her in at first, helped her relearn things like grocery lists and dinner plans, though Elise never quite stopped living between breaths. For a while she tried therapy. The therapist asked about her dreams. Elise said she didn't have any. Not anymore. She went on a few dates, though none lasted past the first awkward glass of wine. How do you talk about a life interrupted? How do you laugh when part of your soul is still caught in the woods? She kept Noah's bedroom things in boxes, stacked in the corner of her closet. Sometimes, when the house was especially still, she would open one and breathe in whatever faint scent still lingered. Bubblegum. Pine. Dust. Mark never left Tennessee. He bought a second-hand trailer just 20 minutes from the cabin and took a job with the Park Service, maintaining the old hiking paths, repairing trail signs, keeping cabins clear of rot and mold. He liked the silence of it, the repetition. It gave him a reason to be near the place where everything had ended. People started calling him the quiet one, the ranger who didn't talk much but who knew every inch of the woods. He visited the cabin every fall, usually in October when the air grew sharp and the trees burned orange. The owners had stopped renting it out years ago, not long after Noah's disappearance, and the structure sat mostly empty. But Mark still brought wood for the porch, still patched the roof, still kept the weeds trimmed back, as if Noah might come stumbling out of the forest and need to find his way home. He left lights on inside sometimes, just one, just enough. Neither Elise nor Mark ever said goodbye. Not really. Grief was their common language now, spoken at a distance. A phone call on Noah's birthday, a card at Christmas. 16 years of silence that echoed louder than words. Because the thing about closure, the thing no one ever tells you, is that sometimes it never comes. Sometimes all you get is the waiting. The storm rolled in just after midnight, a low growl that deepened into something wilder. Rain fell in sharp bursts, wind howled through the trees like an old song nobody remembered the words to. Somewhere above the mountains, lightning tore the sky open with a sound like the earth splitting. The bolt struck the cabin in the early hours clean, direct, and merciless. By the time the neighbors from the next ridge spotted the glow through the trees, the fire had already begun to climb. It moved like a living thing, licking up the old pine siding, curling into the eaves, hungry after so many quiet years. The call went out at 2:14 a.m. It took the local volunteer fire crew 20 minutes to reach the site, winding their way up slick dirt roads and narrow switchbacks. When they arrived, the air smelled of sap and smoke and wet earth, and the trees around the clearing glowed amber from the flames still clawing at the edges of the roof. The team worked quickly, racing the fire with soaked tarps and pounding boots. The structure held, mostly. The walls were scorched, but intact. The porch collapsed, but the beams inside held fast. By dawn, only one part of the cabin continued to smolder, the chimney. It should have been solid stone, impervious. But something about the way it burned struck the firefighters as strange. The flames hadn't climbed it. They seemed to come from it, like the chimney itself had been holding something flammable, something waiting. Captain Jensen, a veteran of 30 years, stood in the ruins, and watched the smoke rise from the brick. "We'll need to tear this out," he said, his voice low. "It's not safe, could fall in on itself." They returned with crowbars and sledgehammers that afternoon. The top came apart slowly, brick by blackened brick. It wasn't until they reached the middle of the chimney, just where it passed behind the living room wall, that the crew chief called out. His voice cracked through the quiet, sharp, and disbelieving. "Get over here! There's something inside!" By dusk, the fire was out, but the clearing felt colder somehow. The cabin still stood, smoking and blackened, a skeleton of itself. But something had been sealed inside that chimney, something small and wrong and waiting 16 years to be found. The first thing they saw was red. A small flash of it beneath the soot-black bricks, muted but unmistakable. It looked almost like fabric at first, a scorched corner of insulation maybe, or a melted remnant of something left behind. But as the firefighter reached in with a gloved hand and pulled it loose, the shape became clear, a child's shoe. Red canvas, frayed at the seams, the sole half melted and brittle. It was impossibly small, no bigger than a man's palm, and it was unmistakable. The crew went still. No one spoke. Captain Jensen took the shoe gently from the younger firefighter, his hands trembling in spite of the heat still radiating from the chimney. "Get the sheriff," he said. They kept digging, with more care this time. The laughter and casual talk that had buzzed earlier was gone, replaced by something tight, reverent. It wasn't just that the cabin had burned, it was that something had been hidden, something no one was supposed to find. And then, about 2 feet down into the flue, the hammer struck bone. It made a different sound than brick, a softer, hollow crack, like stepping on a dry twig. The firefighter who heard it didn't move right away. He just stood frozen, crowbar still pressed against the broken brick, staring at the pale shape emerging from the soot. By the time the sheriff's deputies arrived, the team had cleared enough to see the truth. There, nestled inside the dark, narrow chamber of the chimney, was a tiny skeleton. Curled in on itself, knees pulled to chest, arms wrapped around the shins as if the child had laid down long ago and simply fallen asleep. There were no clothes left, only singed fibers clinging to the bone, and one lone thread of what looked like a blanket twisted beneath the ribs. The remains were so small, so still. One of the younger deputies had to step outside, hands on his knees, breathing hard. The fire chief just stared. He'd seen all kinds of tragedy over the years, but this felt like a secret too long buried, something deliberately hidden. And the shoe. That single scorched red shoe. It was too familiar. By nightfall, crime scene tape fluttered in the mountain breeze. The cabin stood quiet again, but it was no longer just the place where a boy disappeared. Now it was something else entirely. Now, it was the place where a child had been found. The headline broke before the sun rose. A local reporter had heard the scanner call, then confirmed the story through a friend in the fire department. Child's remains discovered in chimney of remote cabin. Investigation ongoing. It spread like smoke first on regional news sites, then picked up by national outlets, each one spinning the story tighter. A boy lost in the woods, a decades-old mystery, now reignited by fire. Elise saw it while standing in line at the coffee shop, the glow of her phone catching her attention. She clicked the link on instinct, not expectation. But the moment she read the words Smoky Mountains and Red Shoe, her legs gave out. She collapsed to the floor, coffee spilling beside her, hands clutched over her mouth as the screen blurred with tears. Someone asked if she was okay, but she couldn't speak. The panic rose too fast, the kind that knows before the facts arrive, the kind a mother carries in her bones. She didn't call Mark, she didn't have to. By noon his voicemail was full, and a news van was parked at the edge of his trailer's driveway. He refused interviews, kept the door shut, sat on the edge of his bed, arms crossed, eyes locked on the wall as the news replayed on the dusty television in the corner. They showed the chimney, the bricks stained with ash, the small bagged evidence being carried to the forensics van. They said a shoe had been recovered. That DNA testing was underway. That it was likely the remains belonged to a child who had vanished in 2009. Mark turned off the television. He opened the bottom drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a plastic sandwich bag. Inside it, perfectly preserved, was a single red shoelace, the pair to the one found in the flue. He held it between his fingers, not because it proved anything, but because it felt like holding his son's hand again, just for a moment. "I don't believe it," he whispered. When the sheriff's office called 2 days later, requesting DNA samples from both Elise and Mark for confirmation, Elise didn't hesitate. She drove through the night to submit hers in person, her hands trembling as the technician swabbed the inside of her cheek. Mark showed up late, quiet, unwilling. "It's not him," he insisted. "It can't be. He wouldn't have been in there. Someone would have heard him. Someone would have—" But he couldn't finish the sentence, because someone hadn't, and that silence had lasted 16 years. The chimney was never supposed to be touched again. It had been sealed shut decades earlier, with old mortar and a rusted grate bolted over the hearthstone of those relics people forget about in houses too old to matter. But the fire had broken it open. What the flames didn't destroy, the investigation peeled away layer by layer until the truth sat exposed beneath the ash and brick dust. It didn't take long for the forensic team to realize something was wrong. The first clue was the soot pattern. The interior walls of the flue were dark, but not from regular smoke flow. The discoloration was patchy, inconsistent, as if something had burned within the chimney, not passed through it. Then came the mortar analysis. The bricks around the midsection had been reinforced, not during the original construction, but years later. A different kind of cement, a different technique. Sloppy, almost hurried, like someone trying to seal something in, not keep heat out. The real answer came when they disassembled the chimney base. Behind the wall, just above where the fireplace would have open-sealed behind plaster and stone, was an inner crawl space. Too small for any adult to navigate comfortably. Big enough, though, for a child. Someone had bricked it up from the inside. The forensic lead, a man named Travers, stood over the exposed cavity and let the silence settle over the team before speaking. "There's no soot trail out," he said. "No signs of escape. This was intentional." The others nodded, grim-faced. In their line of work, you learned quickly to recognize the difference between tragedy and concealment. This was the latter. They mapped it meticulously, measured every inch of the flue, photographed every brick. The skeleton, now carefully removed, had been curled too tightly, arms wrapped over knees, spine arched upward. Not a fall, not an accident. A pose chosen or forced. Later, they found faint scratches inside the mortar. Tiny marks, irregular but clustered, like fingers scraping brick. And higher up, a few wisps of what looked like fabric stuffed between the bricks. It was too burned to identify, but it smelled faintly of smoke and something else. Something older. Mark came the next day, escorted by a deputy. He didn't speak when they showed him the cavity, just stared into the dark, narrow space where the flue yawned open like a mouth caught mid-scream. "They closed it," he whispered. "They didn't want anyone to find him. And for 16 years, no one had. They weren't supposed to be looking anymore. The recovery team had already swept the chimney and removed what remained. The bricklayers were there to seal it back per order of the county and turn the cabin into a crime scene preserved by structure, not by evidence. But one firefighter stayed behind a little longer. Eli Carver was young, newer to the department, the kind who asked too many questions and stayed behind after the trucks had left. Something about the chimney hadn't sat right with him. He kept thinking about the way the child's bones had curled inward, about the scratches they found on the stone. It didn't feel finished. So he returned that evening, under the excuse of checking for structural compromise, and crawled inside the blackened hearth with only a flashlight and a crowbar. That's when he found the page. It was folded tight and jammed into a narrow crack where the chimney throat met the flue-edged, so far back it took 2 tries to pry it loose without tearing it. Singed at the edges, water-stained and brittle, but the words miraculously were still there. Slanted letters, uneven spacing, and lines that dipped downward the farther they went. A child's handwriting. He took it to the light, heart thudding. There were no names, No dates. Just a short entry scrawled in pencil, written in the fragile, halting voice of someone very small and very scared. "It's dark. I think he forgot about me. I tried to count how many sleeps, but I don't remember anymore. I hear the birds in the morning and the wind at night. I'm hungry. I didn't mean to make him mad. I was just trying to find the door. If Mommy reads this, I love you. If Daddy reads this, I'm sorry I didn't stay close." Eli folded the page back with shaking hands. The words felt like a whisper straight out of the grave. When the sheriff's office received the note, they showed it to Elise first. She held it as if it might fall apart in her hands, one thumb pressed to the smudged corner where the name Noah was faintly scrawled in the upper margin written small, as if even he wasn't sure he was allowed to leave his name behind. Mark refused to look at it. "It's not his," he said, even as his voice cracked. "He didn't write that. He wouldn't." But Elise had already started to cry, because she remembered the slant of those letters, the way her son wrote his S's backward, and because he'd been trying to come home, even from the chimney, even in the dark. The road hadn't changed much, still narrow and winding, still hemmed in by thick trees that leaned in like silent witnesses. The gravel crunched under the wheels of the sheriff's cruiser as it climbed toward the clearing, and neither Elise nor Mark spoke, not during the drive, not when the trees parted to reveal the cabin, not when they saw what was left of it. The cabin stood in the hush of late morning, charred at the edges, its porch gone, windows boarded, crime scene tape fluttering from the eaves like tattered prayer flags. The chimney, once tall and solid, was now reduced to a jagged spine of broken brick and exposed stone, still marked with spray paint from the forensic team's measurements. Elise stepped out first. Her shoes sank slightly into the damp earth, and she paused, one hand resting on the car door as she looked up at the building. Her breath caught in her throat. 16 years. That's how long it had been since she'd stood in this spot, her hand wrapped around a cup of coffee she never got to drink, calling her son's name into the woods. The wind sounded the same, the trees still swayed. As if time had just held its breath. Mark got out slowly. His jacket hung loose around his shoulders, and he looked thinner than she remembered. They hadn't been in the same place in years. Not really. Phone calls, letters, the occasional update from a lawyer or a sheriff, those had replaced their marriage. Grief had reshaped them both in separate silences. Now here they were, together again, in the last place they were ever a family. "I didn't think I'd ever come back," Elise said softly, her voice almost lost to the wind. Mark didn't answer right away. He stepped past her, into the clearing, toward the blackened remains of the porch. He looked down at the foundation, at the spot where the chimney had once connected to the hearth. "They said he was inside there," he murmured, "this whole time." Elise followed him, slower, more cautious, as if stepping too hard might wake something that had finally gone still. She stared at the place where the chimney had cracked open, where Noah's bones had been found curled into the stone. Her knees buckled, but she caught herself on the doorframe, breath trembling. "He was so close," she whispered. 16 years, and he was right here. Mark turned to her then, his face raw, and said the only thing that could survive between them. "I'm sorry I stayed. I thought I'd find him. Or that he'd find me." Elise didn't answer. She just reached out, her hand finding his. Not in forgiveness, not in reunion, but in the shared truth of what the woods had taken from them. And what they had finally horribly found. The sheriff's office received the call on a Wednesday morning, just as the story had started to slip from the national headlines. The man on the line spoke in a voice strained by age and cigarettes, thick with the kind of southern drawl that softened syllables like melting wax. He didn't ask for anyone by name. Just said, calmly, that he'd seen the news about the boy in the chimney. And that he remembered things he hadn't told anyone in a very long time. His name was Clyde Rayner, 83 years old, and living alone in a small trailer outside Gatlinburg. He had once been the groundskeeper for the Appalachian rental company that managed the cabin back in the 1980s, before the company went bankrupt, before the property was sold. before any of the newer names were etched into the land. They sent a deputy to his place with a recorder. Clyde met him on the porch, his oxygen tank hissing softly as he waved the young man inside. "I didn't say nothing before," he admitted, lowering himself into a recliner with a long, rattling breath. "Wasn't my business back then. And you learn not to poke your nose where it don't belong. But I remember that cabin. I remember those woods. And I remember the kids." The deputy blinked. "What kids, Mr. Rayner?" "Other ones," Clyde said. "Not just the boy you found. There were others before him. Not all at once. Years apart. Little ones, mostly. Went missing. Always nearby. Never from the same family. Never while anyone was watching. He said he'd found Cigna scraps of fabric caught in trees, a broken doll's arm in the stream bed, once even a shoe with the toe worn clean through like someone had been walking for miles. He brought it to the office, but no one cared. "The owners didn't want bad press," he said. "Told me to stop making trouble." When asked why he was speaking now, after all this time, Clyde looked out the window, eyes distant. "Because the fire brought him out," he said. "And because that chimney always felt wrong. You ever walk past something and feel cold, even in July? That's how it was, like it was breathing underneath." The deputy tried to press for names, details. Clyde couldn't give them. Time had blurred the specifics. But he was certain of one thing. The land around that cabin had been swallowing children long before the Whitakers ever stepped foot there. And now, finally, one of them had been found. The floorboards groaned as if remembering something. It had been nearly a month since the fire, and the cabin what was left of it stood under constant supervision. Investigators had combed through the chimney, the attic, the surrounding woods. But the crawl space beneath the cabin hadn't been touched yet, not properly, until the dogs arrived. 2 black labs, trained for cadaver detection, moved silently through the ruins, their noses to the ground, their handlers trailing behind with soft words and tighter leashes. The cabin floor had partially collapsed in the fire, exposing dark soil beneath the joists, a belly of earth untouched for decades. The dogs circled a spot near the back, just under where the bedroom used to be, and stopped. Then they started to bark. The team marked the area. Within hours, shovels broke the surface, and what emerged didn't feel like a surprise. It felt like confirmation. The soil was looser than it should have been, freshly turned at some point in the past, but packed back in with care. Not a grave in the traditional Cinceno markers, no stone but a hiding place. A small one. The first thing they found was a plastic soldier, the kind that came in buckets of 50. Its arm was missing, melted at the elbow. Then a second toy, something handmade, maybe a small cloth rabbit. Its face blackened, but still stitched with button eyes. They found a jawbone next. Tiny, human, more followed. Vertebrae, ribs. A wrist, still curved in on itself like it had been protecting something. And then they found the box. It was metal, roughly the size of a lunch pail, rusted so badly the hinges crumbled when they tried to open it. Inside was a slow kind of horror. A child's bracelet, a lock of blonde hair tied with string, and a photograph faded, curling at the corners of a young girl sitting on the porch of the very same cabin. On the back, written in shaky adult handwriting, "Stay quiet, stay small, stay safe." They pulled out more bone fragments from the crawl space before the day was done. Not all from the same child. Forensics would later confirm that much. Different ages, different timelines. All hidden beneath the floor, buried under the place where people came to laugh, to sleep, to forget their lives for a weekend. Elise was called that evening. They didn't tell her everything, just that Noah might not have been the first. And Mark, when he heard, only nodded. "They always said the ground was soft up here," he muttered. "Turns out it wasn't the rain. The lockbox wasn't just rusted, it was rotted through in parts, the metal flaking away like paper when the forensic technician lifted it from the soil. It had no lock, only a latch held shut by time and pressure. Inside, beneath the cloth doll and the bracelet and that photograph with the haunting inscription, were 5 cassette tapes, each wrapped in what had once been plastic, but had long since shriveled and torn with age. Most were unmarked, but one had a label, written in shaky block letters with a black marker now faded to gray. Noah, Week 1. Elise was there when they found it. She hadn't planned to be. But she'd returned to the cabin after hearing about the crawl space, unable to stay away, unable to let strangers uncover pieces of her son's story while she sat miles away waiting for a call. When they pulled the tape from the box, one of the officers hesitated, then handed it to her gently, as if it might fall apart in her hands. She didn't speak, just held it like something holy. They had to find a player, which took longer than expected. No one used tapes anymore, not really. But a detective brought one the next day, a dusty Panasonic model with clunky buttons and a whirring that sounded like breathing. They placed it on a folding table inside the temporary command tent beside the cabin, and Elise sat down slowly, the tape in her lap like a fragile animal. When the audio began, it was just static. Then a soft clatter, something falling over. A few seconds passed. And then, "Is it on now?" Her heart stopped. It was Noah's voice. Younger, higher than she remembered, threaded with both excitement and uncertainty. "Okay, I guess I talk now. This is my first tape. He said I should say what I do every day, so I woke up, and it was still dark. The flashlight doesn't work anymore. I asked if I could go outside, but he said it's not time yet." Elise's breath came in short bursts. Her hands clenched around the edge of the table. The voice continued, halting and uneven, like he was trying to remember what mattered. "I miss Mommy. I want to go home. But he says I'm not ready. He says I have to learn how to be small first." The room felt too quiet after that, just the hum of the tape and the trembling breath of a mother listening to her child from a time she could never reach again. "Maybe I'll be ready next week," the voice whispered. And then, silence. They listened to the rest of the tapes over the course of 3 days. Each one was worse than the last, not because of what they showed, but because of what they suggested. The silences, the stuttering. The way Noah's voice, small and fragile on that first recording, grew quieter with each new cassette, as though he was vanishing piece by piece while still alive. The second tape began with humming, not a song, just low, tuneless notes, almost like a lullaby sung without melody. Then the click of something metal, maybe a latch, maybe a lock. Noah whispered into the recorder. "He said we're playing the game again today, the hiding game. I'm not allowed to make noise this time. If I do, the friend in the wall will come out." No one in the room moved. Elise had pressed her fingers to her mouth, and one of the detectives, a father of 3, turned his face away. "The friend is small like me. I think he used to be a kid, but now he's not anymore. He doesn't talk, only scratches. I don't like it when he scratches." The third tape had longer stretches of silence. Noah seemed more tired, as though even speaking to the recorder had become too heavy to hold. He coughed a few times and mentioned the cold. Then, another rule. No light at night. He says the friend doesn't like light. It makes him mad. So I cover my eyes. Even if I'm scared, I don't turn it on. If I do, the friend will come out again. By the fourth tape, his voice had taken on a whispering quality, like he was mimicking someone else, or being told what to say. "Today," he said, "I was good. I stayed quiet when the friend came to the wall. I didn't scream. I listened to the scratching. He said that's how I learned the stories, the old ones. He says the friend wasn't always in the wall. He got put there, like me." The final tape was labeled only with a number, 5. On this one, Noah's voice barely registered, just breathing and murmurs, sentences that trailed off into nothing. "I think I saw the boy today," he said once. "The one who came before. He was looking at me through the bricks. I don't think he has eyes anymore." Elise couldn't finish the last one. She stood up halfway through and walked out into the woods behind the command tent, where she doubled over and wept into the earth. Because Noah hadn't just been trapped. He hadn't just been taken. He had been taught how to disappear. The cabin didn't give up its last secrets easily. After the chimney was torn out and the crawlspace exhumed, The structure stood like a wounded animal wounded, but not yet empty. There were still too many questions, too many wrong angles, in a place meant to be square. So when the lead investigator noticed a discrepancy in the wall depth along the east bedroom just a few inches too wide to make sense on the blueprint, they brought in the tools. The drywall cracked like paper. Behind it, old slats and insulation sagged with rot, then wood, then nothing. A hollow space, long and narrow, about 2 feet across, maybe 10 feet tall. A passage, if you could call it that, running parallel to the room like a hidden artery. No one spoke for a long moment. They widened the opening slowly, cutting the edges clean. A single beam was removed, then another. A flashlight pierced the darkness inside, and what it revealed stopped the entire crew cold. Scratch marks lined the inside of the wallong, frantic ones at first, near the bottom, then slower ones higher up, as if whoever had made them had grown taller. Or someone else had taken their place. The marks didn't follow any neat pattern. They spiraled in some places, dug deep in others, even carved symbols into the wood that no one could quite recognize. But it was the drawings that said the most. Faint, childlike, charcoal or ash, maybe even bits of crayon long turned brittle with time. There were stick figures, some with arms raised, some without arms at all. A sun in the corner. A square with a triangle roof labeled Home. And next to it, another shape. A tall rectangle with black scribbles around the edges. It was labeled Him. At the far end of the passage was a pile of cloth and bones. Animal, they thought. Probably. But there was also a child's toothbrush, its bristles yellowed, and a piece of paper rolled tight into a cylinder, tucked into a crack in the wood. When unrolled, it showed a drawing of a figure with no face, surrounded by eyes. Mark stared into the space from the bedroom, his mouth drawn tight. This wasn't just a hiding spot, he said quietly. It was a corridor, a place you get sent. Elise didn't respond. She just ran her hand along the edge of the wall, feeling the grooves made by tiny, desperate fingers. The cabin had been built for escape from the world. But someone had carved another world inside Itone where no child ever truly got out. His name surfaced like something dredged from deep water, unexpected, covered in silt, but disturbingly intact. Birch Tully, a name that echoed through old property records tied to the land surrounding the cabin. No one had mentioned him in the initial investigation. He wasn't the owner, not officially. But someone had quietly transferred the deed to a shell trust in the late 1990s, and Birch's signature appeared faintly on the legal trail, scrawled beside a misspelled mailing address and a post office box that hadn't existed in years. He wasn't easy to find. Birch had been arrested in 2012 after a string of strange trespassing incidents, breaking into unoccupied cabins, setting up camp in abandoned ranger stations, leaving behind hand-carved figures and bundles of feathers. The charges hadn't stuck. He was found unfit to stand trial and placed in long-term psychiatric care. Since then, he'd become just another forgotten patient in the state's crumbling mental health system, tucked away in a quiet ward where the doors didn't lock from the inside. Detective Soren drove 3 hours to see him. The facility was a low, weathered building just east of Knoxville. Birch was brought into the visitor's room slowly, led by an orderly who kept one hand lightly on his shoulder. He shuffled, muttering to himself, wrapped in a threadbare cardigan and smelling faintly of earth and antiseptic. At first he didn't respond to questions. He hummed instead something tuneless, drifting in and out of a whisper. When Soren placed a photo of the cabin on the table, Birch's eyes flicked down and stayed there. He reached out one hand, thin and bird-like, and traced the outline of the chimney with a fingertip. "Still breathing," he said. "What is?" "The house," he whispered. "It remembers." Soren leaned forward. "Did you ever take children there, Birch? Do you know what happened to Noah Whitaker?" Birch blinked. His fingers twitched against the photo. Then, softly. Didn't start with the boy. Started with the first one, the girl with the laugh like wind chimes. She went in willingly, thought it was a game. The wall wanted her. They all go through the wall. He started to hum again, a low sound that seemed to vibrate through his chest. The detective pressed harder, asking dates, names, anything specific. But Birch only smiled now. A faraway, peaceful expression, as if remembering something beautiful that never really happened. "They go in small," he said, "and come out changed, if they come out at all." Then he looked straight into Soren's eyes. "You found one," he said, "but the house still has more." Birch Tully didn't speak for the first 20 minutes of the second interview. He just stared at the window, though there was nothing to see. Just a blank wall on the other side of the glass, the faint hum of a radiator, the thin light of a cloudy morning. Detective Soren waited, patient, his recorder already running. The chair Birch sat in creaked every time he shifted, and he shifted often restless, like something inside him couldn't sit still. It was only when Soren placed the red shoe on the table, enclosed in its evidence bag, that Birch finally turned his head. "That one was his," Birch murmured. "He was quieter than the others. He didn't fight like they did." Soren leaned forward. "Did you put him in the chimney, Birch?" Birch didn't answer. His fingers twitched slightly on the table, reaching for something that wasn't there. Then, his eyes lifted and focused on the detective with startling clarity. "They always return to the chimney," he said. "That's how it works. The fire calls them back, even the ones who get away." Soren's pulse ticked faster. "What fire?" "The first one," Birch said, his voice suddenly low and rhythmic, almost a chant. "She said it, the girl with the ribbons. She said it would break the house's teeth. But it didn't, just made it hungrier." He looked toward the corner of the room as if someone stood there. "Have you ever heard a house breathe, detective?" he whispered. "It's not a sound you forget. The creak of wood, the pop of stone, like lungs full of ash, it waits." Soren tapped the table. "Birch, did you take children to that cabin? Did you trap them inside the walls?" Birch smiled. It was thin, sorrowful, not defiant, just tired. "I didn't make the house," he said. "I just listened to it." He closed his eyes for a moment, long lashes brushing paper-thin cheeks. When he opened them again, they were wet. "I tried to stop after the boy," he said softly. "But the dreams wouldn't end. I see them all the time scratching, whispering, asking why it didn't work, why they didn't come out." Soren sat back, the silence between them thick and unmoving. "You can tear it down," Birch said, his voice now barely audible. "Burn it to the dirt. But they'll come back, they always do. The chimney remembers." And with that, he fell silent again, eyes fixed on the window that showed nothing, and yet somehow reflected everything he'd ever done. The call came late, just past midnight, long after the lights had dimmed in the sheriff's office and the investigation had started to settle into its slow, inevitable paperwork phase. The voice on the other end was cautious, hesitant, like someone testing the ice before stepping out. "I don't know if it matters now," the man said, "but I think something happened to me in that cabin too, a long time ago." His name was James Ellery, 31, married with a daughter, working as a construction foreman in northern Georgia. He had seen the news like everyone else read about the boy in the chimney, the hidden crawl space, the tapes. Something about it had punched through a wall he hadn't even known existed inside him. "I stayed there once," he explained, "when I was 10. My mom rented it for a weekend. I didn't think about it until I saw the pictures. But that's the place. I remember the fireplace." Detectives met him at his home the next afternoon. He looked older than 31, creased at the edges, eyes shadowed, in a way that spoke of years spent, staring too long at ceilings in the dark. He didn't sit when they arrived, just stood by the window, arms crossed. "I thought it was just a dream," he said, "the kind of thing you grow out of, but it didn't go away." He told them about the weekend. How the cabin had felt off from the moment they arrived. How the light didn't fall right in the living room. How the wind never seemed to stop pressing against the windows, even when the trees outside were still. And how, that first night, he'd woken up to the sound of breathing, not from the next room, not from outside, from the fireplace. "I was lying on the couch. My mom was asleep in the bedroom, and I heard it. Slow and heavy, like someone was inside there, breathing through stone." He hadn't moved, hadn't called out, just lay there, frozen, until the breathing stopped. The next morning I told my mom, and she laughed. Said maybe a squirrel had gotten stuck in the flue, but I knew what I heard. He paused then, swallowing hard. I never told anyone about the smell, he said, like burned cloth and something else. Like something dead but far away, like it was waiting. Noah had been taken years later. But James had heard him. Or maybe someone else. Whoever it was, he'd been in the chimney too. He just hadn't made a sound. Not yet. The last tapes were badly damaged, melted in places, warped by time and moisture and the pressure of soil that had pressed against them like a second skin for years. They hissed with static when first played, a ghost language half sound, half silence. But the forensic techs worked slowly, carefully. Hours of playback at different speeds, digital cleaning, frequency isolation. They peeled the noise away like layers of dust, revealing pieces of a voice they had come to know too well. Noah. Tape number 6 had no label, just a fragment, the tape spliced together with surgical care. The boy's voice came in soft, hushed, as though he had learned by then that even the act of speaking could summon something dangerous. Today, he said I was too loud. There was a long pause, then a breath. I tried to whisper. I thought I was quiet. But he said the friend could still hear me. The room where the team was listening fell into total stillness. One of the analysts, a woman in her 50s with a son the same age Noah would have been, pressed a hand to her mouth. He said, tomorrow I go in the chimney. Just for a little while. Just until I learn. But I don't want to go. I don't think it's a place for learning. I think it's where the bad kids stay. There was a sound then. A scratching, faint and irregular, like fingernails against fabric. Then a shuffling noise, something being dragged. A soft grunt. A thump. He told me the house likes quiet. The voice was barely there now, so low it almost vanished beneath the whir of tape and the static hum of the recorder's own breath. If you stay still, it doesn't see you. If you stay still, maybe it forgets you're there. Then silence. 17 seconds of it. At second 18, something else was recorded. Not a word, not a sentence. A single sob. Not loud, not dramatic. Just the kind a child makes when they're trying very, very hard not to cry. The forensic team didn't speak for a long time after the tape clicked off. They didn't need to. It was all there, burned, but not erased. What he feared, what he endured, what he knew was coming. Noah hadn't walked into the chimney. He had been put there. And something had made sure the house stayed quiet. The neighbor's name was Ruth Galliotti 9, nearly blind, and tucked away in a sloping farmhouse just 3 miles from the cabin. She hadn't spoken to police in years. Not during Noah's disappearance, not during the fire, but after the discovery of the tapes and the strange drawings in the walls, a deputy decided to knock on her door anyway, just in case. Ruth answered slowly, her voice gravel and wind. When the deputy mentioned the cabin, she didn't ask for clarification. That place again, she murmured half to herself. I wondered when it would breathe back to life. She spoke in fragments at first, scraps of memory woven between coughs and long silences, about strange gatherings that used to happen deep in the woods, not far from where the cabin stood, late-night fires. Children brought in crying, then leaving quiet, or not at all. They called it the cleansing, Ruth said, hands twisting in her lap. Said some kids were too loud, too wild, born with the wrong light inside. Thought the fire could fix them, burn out the bad. She claimed she never attended. Just watched from her porch when she couldn't sleep. Said she saw men in black coats and women in white dresses carrying lanterns. Once, she thought she saw a child being led by the hand barefoot, even in winter. They always went toward the chimney, she said. That was the center, the mouth, the place the fire spoke from. Detectives dismissed it at first, an old woman's memories clouded by time and rumor. But 2 days later, while combing through archived evidence from an abandoned farmhouse rated in 1978, they found a ledger, water-damaged, mold-rimmed. It had belonged to the Order of the Flame of Grace, a fringe spiritual group dissolved under vague legal pressure in the early 80s. Most of the entries were generic: numbers, ritual notes. But in the back of the book, on a page almost too faded to read, was a list of names under a heading that read, "Candidates presented." Some names were initials, some were just first names, but near the bottom, scrawled between lines, was one in full. Noah W. brought unregistered not ready needs silence. The ink had bled, but the letters were clear enough. Mark held the page when they showed it to him. He didn't speak, just stared, his thumb brushing over the line as though it might vanish if he blinked. The cabin hadn't been just a prison, it had been a pulpit. And the chimney, it seemed, had always been waiting for its next offering. Elise stopped sleeping properly, not long after the tapes. She tried the pills helped her fall into a kind of stillness, but it wasn't rest. She would wake in the early hours with her fists clenched, her sheets twisted around her legs like restraints. The dreams were always the same. She stood inside the cabin, only it wasn't how it looked now. The walls were whole, the fireplace unblackened, the floors clean. Everything was as it must have been once before the fire, before the truth. But the silence was heavy, unnatural, as though the entire house were holding its breath. She would call Noah's name, softly at first, then louder. No one answered. Then the air would shift, and she would hear it scraping. Low and rhythmic. Not behind her. Not upstairs. From inside the chimney. The dream always ended the same way. She'd walk toward the hearth, kneel down, put her hand on the soot-stained brick, and as she leaned closer, something inside would whisper her Namanot Noah's voice, but something colder, more ancient. Then she'd wake, heart pounding, the sound of the whisper still curling in her ears. On the fifth night, she saw the symbol. It was on the inside of the fireplace wall in her dream just above where the flue opened. A circle, etched in ash, bisected by a jagged line like lightning. It pulsed faintly, as if drawn in embers. She woke with a start, sweat clinging to her spine, and drew it on the back of a receipt with trembling fingers before it faded from memory. The next morning, she brought it to the sheriff's office. "I've seen this," she said, placing the paper on the desk. The forensic team pulled up the photos from inside the flue, taken after the remains were removed. Toward the back, obscured by layers of soot and weathering, barely visible even under enhancement, was the same mark, carved crudely into brick. A circle, a split. "It's not just in my head," she whispered. They ran it through databases, nothing formal, not religious, not gang-related. But buried deep in an old anthropology journal digitized from a defunct college archive, a match appeared. The symbol was used in early Appalachian rituals to designate chosen silence, a mark for those who were to be purified by isolation. Elise stared at it on the screen. Noah had seen this, known it, dreamed it too, maybe. Whatever lived inside that chimney hadn't just taken him, it had marked him. They found the photograph in a box labeled Thule, be deep in the county records basement, where decades of unsorted files waited beneath layers of dust and disuse. It was dated 1963, black and white, edges curled inward like something recoiling from the light. In the photo, a tall man in a preacher's collar stood on the steps of the cabin, though it looked newer then, unscarred. His eyes were too bright for the grain of the film, his mouth twisted into a smile that felt more like warning than welcome. His name was Reverend Aldrich Tully. The sheriff's office dug deeper. Old church records, buried obituaries, yellowed newsletters from a fringe religious group calling themselves the Flame of Grace. Their meetings weren't held in churches but in the woods, or in private homes, or more often than not at the cabin in the hills that Aldrich Tully called his refining place. His sermons, preserved in pamphlets now brittle with time, read more like incantations than scripture. He preached of purification, of burning the darkness out of the innocent, of silence as salvation. He claimed some children were born split, filled with shadows that could only be removed by fire or confinement. Not punishment, he insisted, mercy. Witnesses were few. Most were gone, dead or unreachable. But one man, once a boy who escaped the group in the early 70s, remembered the cabin well. They said the chimney was the throat of the world, he told investigators, and if you wanted to be reborn, you had to crawl through it, come out the other side clean. Reverend Tully vanished sometime in 1979. No death certificate, no formal disappearance, just gone. And when he did, his property passed without fanfare, without legal struggle to his only child, Birch. He would have been barely 20, but the cabin became his. So did the land. So, it seemed, did the legacy. Birch hadn't been a prophet like his father. But he'd inherited something heavier, belief without understanding, ritual without reason. He'd lived inside the ruins of someone else's madness, and somewhere along the way, he'd made it his own. The marks in the chimney, the symbol in the flue, the tapes, the passageways in the walls. None of it had started with Birch. But when the cabin breathed again when it needed another child, another silence he had answered, just like his father had. They weren't even looking anymore when they found it. The cabin had been cleared for demolition. The walls stripped down to studs, the floorboards pulled, the chimney long gone. All that remained were the bones of the place, raw and open, like something that had been dissected. A contractor, sent to survey the ventilation system before the cabin was torn down, noticed one of the vents was sealed shut from the inside, not rusted or warp-sealed. Screwed in place and painted over, deliberately. He pried it loose and reached in. At first, just dust. Then, something soft, a scrap of cloth. And beneath that, tucked between insulation and wood, a small plastic cassette recorder, the kind sold in gas stations and school supply catalogs in the early 2000s. There was still a tape inside. The label had been rubbed blank by time and heat. It was handed over quietly. No press release, no cameras. Just Elise and Mark, two detectives, and a forensic audio tech seated in a cold room at the sheriff's office while the old machine hummed to life one last time. There was no timestamp, no introduction, just a click, and then the faintest sound. Noah, singing. "I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away." His voice was soft, barely above a breath, the melody broken in places like he couldn't remember all the words. But he kept going, repeating the same lines. A hymn sung through chapped lips and hunger. A lullaby to no one. After nearly a minute, the singing stopped. There was a rustling sound, the shifting of something on stone or brick, then Noah's voice again whispered, almost lost. "I think I'm almost done waiting. I think maybe I'll go tonight." A pause. "If the fire takes me, maybe I'll become light." Then nothing. Not even static. Just the soft, endless quiet of a tape that had run out of time. Elise pressed her hands to her face. Mark didn't move. The room held still, too reverent to speak. That was his last messageno, a plea. Not a cry for help, not even fear. Just hope, in its quietest, most broken form. A boy who had been taught that silence was safety, who had been promised that fire could make him clean, whispering his way into something brighter. If the fire takes me, maybe I'll become light. And then, he was gone. The wind rolled in slow and cold from the water, carrying the scent of salt and something older, something that lived in the space between waves, in the silence beneath them. The small boat rocked gently, as it drifted farther from the shore, away from the noise of land and memory. Elise stood near the bow, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding the urn. It was light, too light for what it contained, for what it meant. Beside her, Mark said nothing. He hadn't spoken much since the final tape. Since Noah's voice had filled the room and then vanished again, like smoke rising from a blown-out candle. There had been no funeral. No church. No casket lowered into dry earth. Just this, a boat and the open sea, because Noah had loved the ocean once. Before the cabin, before the chimney. When he was just a boy who collected shells and drew starfish in bright crayon colors. Before the darkness found him. The Ministera woman Elise had found in a small coastal parish read a psalm softly, but her voice faded beneath the rhythm of the waves. It didn't matter. The words weren't what Elise would remember. She stepped forward, holding the urn close. For a moment, she hesitated. Her fingers trembled. She looked down into the open sea, into that vast moving blue that had never known Noah, never held his weight, never heard him laugh. Then she tipped the urn forward. The ashes moved slowly at first, caught in the wind, some of them rising before they fell. The rest drifted into the water in a soft arc, like dust being given back to something holy. The ocean swallowed them without sound. Elise watched until the last of it was gone. Beside her, Mark finally exhaled. She hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath. The water glittered where the ashes had touched it, just a shimmer, nothing more, but enough. Elise leaned forward, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "You're free now, my love," she said. "The dark can't keep you anymore." She stayed like that for a long time, her eyes fixed on the place where sea and sky met. Not crying, not praying, just watching. Because now, for the first time in 16 years, there was nothing left to search for. Noah had been taken by fire, hidden in stone. Now he belonged to the ocean. And the ocean, at least, would never close its arms around him.